Back everyone, I hope you're doing well. Why pre-colonial Africa didn't have the wheel? Now, I don't know if we can confirm or deny this either. However, let's see what the pre-modernist has to say about this.
Africans south of the Sahara did not use the wheel, and in this video I want to explore why that might have been. First of all, I want to address right away a couple of guesses that some people might make. Some people might guess that Africans did not adopt the wheel because they lacked innovation or, technological creativity. But we know from historical and archaeological evidence that that's not true.
I think I've actually heard this one time before, like I forget where, and I remember it was actually on our other channel, Atlas Pro. The other channel being We React to Science. We were talking about innovation on the continent of Africa. And the guess I'm going to make before we jump into this video really is the geographical differences of tribes and communities and the temperate climates that just alter so differently that create the divides and not the unity to create something. However, I'm very much excited to learn why.
Technological creativity. But we know from historical and archaeological evidence that that's not true because they had other technologies. They had textile production, they worked with iron. When Europeans arrived in Africa, the African rulers were quite eager to acquire their firearms and even produce firearms locally. So we can rule that out right now. I mean, they were perfectly fine creating and adopting technologies. Another guess that someone might make would be that, people of sub-Saharan Africa were cut off from the rest of the world and therefore did not have the opportunity to borrow technologies from Europe and Asia.
Depends on when you say cut off. Like, that's not true either, because you can just see like Ethiopia in their trade routes that they had in I forget what you call that. Right? It's not the Red Sea, is it? Might be the Red Sea. Well, what do you got to say about this?
But we also know that that's not true because large parts of Africa were, in fact, connected with the rest of the world through trade networks. Mm-hmm. In West Africa, they were connected to the Mediterranean through this Trans-Saharan trade network. Mm-hmm. And in East Africa and parts of Southern Africa, they were tied into the Indian Ocean trade network.
Yes, that's what I was referencing.
And in fact, some African merchants did visit India and Southeast Asia in the Middle Ages and would have
That's interesting.
had the opportunity to see wheeled carts firsthand, and yet they never used that technology in Africa. So the question remains, why didn't they have the wheel? In order to answer that question, I want to start by raising another question, which is, why would we expect Africans to use the wheel?
Seems like a loaded question. However, why would we expect? Let's just say we do expect. Because we see it other places. Because wheels help you go more efficiently from place to place. Helps with simple things like farming and agriculture, as well as like commerce and trade. And you can say it helps with warfare with the chariots. That's why I would expect, because it makes you more efficient. Because it creates better physics for movement.
We might assume that was the standard mode of transporting goods in other parts of the world, but that's not actually the case. Of course, in North and South America, they never used wheeled transport prior to the arrival of the Spanish and Portuguese. But also in the Eastern Hemisphere, in Europe itself, wheeled transport was not the preferred mode of transportation. Europeans in the Middle Ages preferred to transport their goods by water.
That's true. That is true. Depends on where you're at too. Like if you're not near a river, that's not true. But yeah,
by boat along the coastlines or on the rivers, and that suited Europe very well because Europe is a peninsula of peninsulas and has an abundance of navigable rivers. So that was always what Europeans tried to use because it was so cheap and easy to transport by water. Far easier and cheaper than transporting via a wagon or a cart over a road. There were large parts of the year when the roads, which were just mud tracks basically, were not really passable to wagons.
Yeah.
So even in Europe itself, wheeled transport was not the preferred option. They did use it as a secondary option. It was used for local transport of goods, usually. It was very rarely used for long-distance transport, but it could be used, for example, between a farm and a neighboring village or town, or within a town, or to get from the river to that, the last leg of the journey up to a settlement. Something like that could happen. But if we zoom out and look at the Eastern Hemisphere as a whole, we see that pretty much no one used wheeled transport as their preferred mode of transportation.
Really?
Like I said, in Europe, they preferred water transportation whenever possible. That was also true in southern China and Southeast Asia, where there were similar conditions, lots of navigable rivers and coastline, and in the case of China, tons and tons of canals. So they did have wheels there that they used for transportation. They used wagons and carts, but those were always the secondary mode, not the primary mode. And then if you look in between those two extreme parts of Eurasia, in between in the Middle East, Central Asia, and then extending over into North Africa, North India, Northern China, the preferred mode of transportation was the camel. And in fact, it was so preferred that in many of those regions, wheeled transport did not exist at all.
A lot of times there's a lot of sand. You got the Sahara. You have, Saudi Arabia is mostly like desert. You have a lot of desert and dry climate, and then you have I can see how that could easily be thwarted with, you don't really have you'd have to really build an off-road type cart or something for something like that to work.
Now, in the ancient world, they did use wagons and carts a lot, even in the Near East. But in late antiquity, around the 4th, 5th centuries of the Common Era,
I do actually, let's go back a little bit. I will say that I think the creator of the chariot was in this area as well. So chariots were used a lot in this area. So the wheels were used. It just really depends on what we're talking about when we say use of the wheel. Because there's the military aspect, there's the trade aspect, there's like the personal everyday life aspect.
They transitioned away from carts and wagons and to camels. And the reason for that was very simple. Camels were better, basically. They could carry more weight, and they could do it more cheaply. Camels were easier to procure. They were cheaper to construct. You don't construct a camel. They were cheaper to maintain, cheaper to operate, and they did not require roads to be maintained the way wheeled transport would require. So it was far and away a superior technology over wagons. And because of that, they completely displaced wagons, such that in many of the areas where camels were used, wheeled transport was virtually unknown. There were some kind of edge areas where camels and wagons coexisted, like in Anatolia, North India, places like that. But there were large areas of Eurasia and North Africa where wheeled transport had completely disappeared.
Behind us. Before us stretches the desert, hundreds of miles of sand and gravel, sometimes firm and smooth so that we can make good time, sometimes perfectly hard under a thin covering of soft sand, sometimes soft and without bottom under a thin hard crust which suddenly gives way under the wheels. Sometimes as we shoveled and sweated, a camel caravan would pass, and how scornfully the camels would look at us.
And so, in light of that, we might also ask another question, which is, why didn't Europe adopt the camel?
Bruh, they're not native there. That's probably why I would say. But horses were not native a lot of places versus Eurasia, and they were moved. That's an interesting one. I'm not sure. What's the answer?
And that's basically a similar question to asking why Africans did not use the wheel.
I was about to say, I thought he was going to say horse.
There's a demonstrably superior technology that the people of Europe failed to use.
Really? Interesting thing. I mean, they had a lot of things like oxen. So there's like comparable animals, horses, oxen, XYZ.
Now, was it because Europeans lacked innovation?
Of course not.
Was it because they lacked the creativity to realize the potentials of using camel transport? Or were they so mired in cultural conservatism that they could not transition to a better technology even when it was staring them in the face?
It's quite expensive also to move that many camels when you have that long history of something that does work. So, I mean, there's not a lot of desert climates. There's more, the terrain's a little bit more, the terrain's harder depending on if it's if it's muddy. Okay, that's not the right way to look at it. But like I said, they had oxen, they had horses. So there's comparable means to the use of an animal to transport stuff.
Because after all, they were aware of camel technology. They were aware of camel caravans, but they didn't adopt it.
Not always.
I would suggest that it wasn't a problem of lack of innovation. Now, hear me out. Let's assume, for the sake of argument, that Europeans are human beings. And like all other human beings on the planet, they have innovation, they have creativity, they have the ability to adopt new technologies when those technologies present themselves and when they are useful to them. After all, that's what every other population in the world does. So there's no reason to assume that Europeans would be any different. Okay, but if we take those assumptions as given, and if we assume that Europeans had innovation, how do we account for the fact that they did not adopt the camel, since we know the camel was a superior technology? At this point, you might be thinking, well, dummy, obviously, it's because of environment,
Not necessarily, because you got different types of camels. So I wasn't really thinking about camels being in the environmental side, but more on the side of like there's comparable animals.
Camels are not well suited to the European environment. To which I say, yeah, exactly. That's it. That's the point. At least that's the consensus view among Africanists who have...
I think camels would love Europe, by the way. I mean, they don't have to work as hard. They would probably adapt to the environment. They are suited to carry water for a long period of time, and there's abundance of water. I think they wouldn't have... I mean, it depends on what part of Europe, but like in the steppe, in the plains, I feel like they would love it.
Have written on this topic regarding Africa. Why did they not use the wheel is because of environmental reasons. In order to operate wagons, you have to have animals to pull the wagons. And in the case of much of sub-Saharan Africa, it's not possible to have those animals, or at least it wasn't historically, because of trypanosomiasis, or sleeping sickness, which is a disease that is fatal to livestock. And it's spread by an insect called the tsetse, or the tsetse fly. So anywhere where the tsetse fly lives, those are areas that historically they could not keep livestock, and therefore they would have no use for wheeled vehicles because they would have no animals to pull them.
This deadly disease is one of the most widespread in Africa, especially in the equatorial areas. So effective have been its inroads that large areas where colonization was attempted had to be abandoned by both settlers and the natives. Sleeping sickness not only attacks man, but it attacks and kills his domestic livestock as well.
So is it like a similar to malaria? Obviously, malaria is mosquito, not a fly. But is it similar?
Sleeping sickness is caused by a protozoan organism, the trypanosome. There are different species of trypanosomes. In general, they are about 20 microns long, equipped with a flagellum and undulating membrane for locomotion.
Now, there are some parts of sub-Saharan Africa where the tsetse fly does not live, and therefore trypanosomiasis is not a problem. And there were population groups in East and Southern Africa that historically kept cattle, and some still do. And those could have had wheels. They could have used wagons pulled by livestock. but they didn't do that there either. I think the reason for that, wagons are useful for farmers to transport their goods to the market. But cattle herders don't really need wagons to do that. They can have their product walk to the market itself.
Yeah.
So you have the situation where areas that were wet enough to sustain agriculture also had the tsetse fly, and therefore they could not use livestock. And those
Dang. That's something I never knew.
areas that were more arid, too arid for a tsetse fly, were also typically too arid for rain-fed agriculture. I would love it if any Africanists discover this video and want to chime in and, tell me about sources I may have missed, or angles on this topic that I might not have covered. Please, by all means, put them in the comments. And if I said something that was incorrect or something that's out of date, it's very possible, because I'm not a specialist in Africa. So it's very possible that I missed out on some more recent literature. So if there's recent scholarship on this that challenges what I've said, please also put that in the comments so I can learn. But yeah, thanks for watching.
We'd given the little boys cigarettes and pennies, and they hated to see us go. But the town was preparing to give us a send-off in the manner of the Sahara.
Wow. Interesting video. I think I was humbled at the end, actually, with the he kind of like teased all the way up to like the last chapter about this disease, the sleeping sickness. Never heard of it. And I think I think a lot of stuff when it comes to like how Africa isn't developed today it is catching up. Africa is catching up. When you see the sub-Saharan nations, like you look at economic development, you look at just growth in those regions. Africa has the highest ceiling amongst pretty much any continent in the world, just because of the vast resources in the ground. You could look at a place like Lagos, Nigeria, which Nigeria as a whole holds nearly 250 million people. Lagos, Nigeria is like the economic hotspot of Africa, really. You look at places like Ethiopia. You look at places like South Africa. You look at places like Morocco. It doesn't matter if we're looking sub or above the Sahara. Africa has an opportunity to really become an economic stronghold past a lot of these challenges. And a lot of these challenges are prior to like some of the developmental opportunities. For example, this sleeping sickness could have plagued them for hundreds of years just because of the catch-22 between having agricultural land that can be used versus having a fly that spreads sickness to any agricultural livestock that might use that land. So the past doesn't matter comparatively to what the present beholds us, but it gives us a lot of context, especially when we look at comparativisms, like how Europe versus Africa developed, or the West versus the East argument. Environment changes everything. Cold, hot, cold. That's how our planet is shaped, top to bottom. But we're all one species, so let's help each other out continuously. Thank you guys so much for watching. Until next time, like and subscribe. Peace out. Bye-bye.